Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us for the e-launch and discussion of the State of Southeast Asia 2022 survey. I am Farinadine Seth from the IC's Yusof Ishak Institute, your MC for this morning. Before we begin, please allow me to draw your attention to a few housekeeping matters. For technical issues, please use the chat function to reach out to our technical support team. To ask questions of the speakers, please use the Q&A function, stating your name and affiliation together with your question. Thank you for your cooperation. To begin the proceedings, I'd like to invite Mr. Choi Shing Kwok, Head of ASEAN Studies Centre, Director and CEO of IC's Yusof Ishak Institute, to deliver the welcome remarks and to launch the survey. Mr. Choi, please.
Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, very warm welcome to the launch of the State of Southeast Asia Survey Report by the ASEAN Studies Centre. I believe this is something that many of us have been eagerly waiting for. As we enter into its fourth edition, the survey continues to provide insights into the geostrategic developments and challenges in the ASEAN region through the lenses of Southeast Asians. The aim of the survey is to present a view of the prevailing thoughts and attitudes of informed respondents across a wide range of issues that impact on Southeast Asia and on ASEAN. This year's survey polled the views and perceptions of 1,677 respondents from government, research institutes, private sector, civil society and media, as well as regional and international organizations. The survey was conducted over a period of 7 weeks from early November to the end of December last year. The shared concerns and preoccupations of Southeast Asians and their diverse views about ASEAN's regional standing can be gleaned from the results that will be shared at this session. Against the backdrop of the evolving pandemic, the Myanmar crisis, and the US-China rivalry, this year's survey features new questions on the popularity of COVID-19 vaccines, ASEAN's response to the Myanmar crisis, as well as other regional developments, such as the strengthening of the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, or Quad, the new Trilateral Security Arrangement between Australia, the UK, and the US, or AUKUS, and the possible Chinese membership in the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP, as well as the US's continued absence from it. Apart from these interesting questions, I'm sure many of you are also interested to follow the trends and shifts in the evolving regional architecture, such as the receptiveness to the leadership of various major powers in this region, the perception of trust towards some of these powers, and the extent and reach of their soft power in the region. With the benefit of 4 years' worth of data, we continue to conduct time series analysis to observe the continuity of existing trends and emergence of new ones, taking into consideration very interesting country-level data, which will be useful for more in-depth analysis by analysts as well as observers going forward. With that quick introduction, I look forward to presenting the results and hearing the comments and insightful discussion by a very distinguished panel of discussants from the region who will share their interpretations as well as their analysis of the survey findings. In this panel, I'm happy to welcome Professor Chan Heng Chee, Professor Zha Daojiong, Professor Thitinan Pongsudhirak, and Professor Evelyn Goh. I believe their insights will be beneficial in unpacking the key results of the survey. Before we commence the panel discussion and the presentation, I would like to invite Ms. Sharon Sia, who is the Senior Fellow and also Coordinator of the ASEAN Studies Centre, to introduce the State of Southeast Asia 2022 Survey Report. So over to you, Sharon.
Thank you, Mr. Choi. A very good morning to everyone in the audience, and thank you for taking the time off to listen to the findings of this result of our report. Let me start here. The objective of the survey is to present a snapshot of prevailing attitudes amongst those that are in a position to inform or influence policy, but it's not meant to be a definitive view of issues in the region. We have designed it to highlight certain perceptions of the region's policymakers, academics, researchers, business people, media personnel, and civil society towards a range of issues. As mentioned by Mr. Choi, there was a total of 1,677 respondents across the 10 ASEAN countries. In terms of methodology, we applied the criteria of nationality, affiliation, age, and also knowledge about current affairs. Because the survey comprised 50 questions in total, which takes approximately 15 to 25 minutes to complete, it was not an easy survey for the layman. We conducted it over a period of 7 weeks from November to December, and it was conducted both online and offline using a mixed sampling method. Here we have 1,507 self-identified Southeast Asians. So that leaves us 15% of the respondents who were reached face-to-face via a panel provider this year. So this is something new that we have done this year. About 170 of them responded via the computer-assisted personal interviews. We also decided to apply a different methodology this year, assigning a 10% weighted average to each country's responses to calculate average figures for ASEAN as a whole. This is to ensure that the responses of each country are represented by equal proportion, given that ASEAN's decision-making processes are based on each country having equal say, regardless of country or population size. And then the final analysis of the regional sentiment was conducted on the weighted data set. We did this for not only the 2022 data, we went back 1 year to do it for the 2021 data so that we can do a comparative analysis. So users of this report should note that the 2021 survey data may have changed moderately with the use of a new weighted average method. So moving on for this year, in 2022, Philippines actually had the highest number of respondents at 400 responses, and this is followed closely by Myanmar at 350, Singapore at 222 persons. And then the rest of the countries you can see from the chart. This is versus 2021 when Vietnam had the highest number of respondents, followed by Singapore and then Myanmar. In terms of affiliation, reversing the trend in 2021, we see more government respondents. They form 38.5%, and they are the largest group of respondents in the survey. And then this is followed by 30.4% from academia, think tanks, and research institutes. We also see an increase in the private sector representation from about 11.1% of the respondents. And the smallest representation is from personnel working in regional or international organizations at 5.3%. In terms of age distribution, the largest group still remains to be the 21 to 35 years old. The second largest group will be those 36 to 45. There's definitely an increase in the number of respondents under 21, actually increased from 2.2% to 5.7%. And this is particularly pertinent for Myanmar respondents. Their increase jumped from 0.6% to 12.3% for those under 21. And for those over 60s, Singapore is leading with 18.9% representation in keeping with our demographics. This is the end of my introduction. I'll pass the time over to Mr. Choi.
Thank you, Sharon. So without much further ado, I would now like to briefly introduce the stellar cast of discussants who will join us during our panel discussion. They are Professor Chan Heng Chee, Ambassador at Large at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Singapore, and also Chairman of our institute. We have Professor Zha Daojiong from the School of International Studies and Institute of South-South Cooperation and Development from Peking University. Professor Thitinan Pongsudhirak, Director of the Institute of Security and International Studies from the Chulalongkorn University. And Professor Evelyn Goh, Director of Research at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University. So thank you very much, all our discussants. I would now like to present the results of the survey in 4 sections. And during each section, after I have made a presentation, I would then invite the panel to comment on the findings in that section. So if I can have the slides up now, we can go to the regional outlook and developments, the beginning of that. Yes. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, here you see the answers to the question, what are the top 3 challenges facing Southeast Asia? So the top 2 challenges for 2022, the answers are the same as last year, with the COVID-19 health threat being cited by just 1% less respondents than they were in 2021. However, the second top challenge, which is the unemployment and recession, was cited by almost 16% fewer respondents compared to last year. So it's 49.8% this year. So the concerns about unemployment and recession, while still high, are less than in the previous year. Thirdly, climate change, which garnered 37%, overtook last year's third-ranked challenge, which was the widening socioeconomic gaps and rising income disparity. If I may just give you a little bit of insight into this same question at the country level, Philippines and Vietnam actually gave higher weightage to climate change, possibly because they, in their countries, felt the impact of extreme weather events more keenly than the other ASEAN states. And this would be quite consistent with other similar climate-related surveys where Philippines and Vietnam's concerns are more elevated. Myanmar's choices at the country level are very different. They cited their top challenge as a deterioration of human rights. And then secondly, it would be COVID-19 threat. So for them, human rights deterioration overtook COVID-19. And then they also have concerns about domestic political stability very high up on their list as well. Let's go to the next question. So the earlier question was about the challenges in Southeast Asia. Here, there are top 3 concerns about ASEAN. So in particular here, it is about ASEAN as an organization. So the top 3 concerns are actually the same as the top 3 concerns last year. The first concern is that ASEAN is slow and ineffective, which garnered 70%. This is a prevalent choice of respondents from Myanmar, from Singapore, from Philippines, from Brunei, from Malaysia, from Thailand, and from Indonesia. So altogether, 7 countries actually believe that this was the greatest concern about ASEAN. The second concern was becoming that ASEAN is becoming an arena for power competition, and this was the top concern for Laos and Vietnam. And finally, the third concern, just to highlight, is again regarding the pandemic. And they are also concerned that ASEAN has very little ability to help overcome this challenge. Just a little bit more information at the country level. Cambodia actually made ASEAN disunity its top choice at more than 60%. For Indonesia, they also had concerns, heightened concerns about ASEAN disunity, doubling from about 25% last year to 46% this year. There was also a significant jump in concern for ASEAN's relevance. Last year, this concern was 22%. This year, it has jumped to 32%. Next slide, please. So this question is about how their individual governments performed in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic. 10% fewer respondents approved of their government's performance compared to 2021. So last year, it was 61%, this year, 51% approved. And those who disapproved increased by 7%. The share of those who rated their governments very poorly actually doubled. So there's if you go finer into the gradations, those who gave the bottom grade actually doubled from 7% to almost 16%. There was a significant change in the response of those from Vietnam. I think understandably, because Vietnam in the previous survey had up to that point performed excellently in its handling of the outbreak, but since vaccination problems started last year, I think the Vietnamese performance was seen to have deteriorated. So for the Vietnamese respondents, they are those who rated in the poor category, respondents jumped from just about 1% to almost 24%. And the neutral category jumped from about 2% to 34%. As for Myanmar, I think the respondents' unhappiness with the political situation were also ended up affecting their, their impact of their view of the COVID-19 handling, and therefore it was unfavorable. Next slide. This question asks, which brand of vaccine do you trust most? So a good majority trust the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. In second place was Sinovac and Sinopharm with about 18.7%. I think intriguingly to this question, the option of any vaccine available is selected by almost 14% of all respondents, which is actually significantly higher than all the other specific brands other than the top two. China's vaccine diplomacy, I think, has, if I may say something that's not quite on this slide, but actually is in the survey. China's vaccine diplomacy has proven to be the most effective in Cambodia. This is seen in the answers to another slide, which we will not show, but it is reflected in the level of recognition of the Chinese vaccines, which is very high among Cambodians, almost 68%. However, with the exception of Cambodia, the recognition of the Chinese vaccine support to the region has not translated into popularity of its vaccine brands among the populations that received it. So, for example, more than 2/3 of respondents in Indonesia and quite a high proportion in Malaysia, more than 60%, identified China as the country that has given them the most vaccine support, as well as to the region. but only a third in Indonesia and less than a quarter in Malaysia prefer Chinese vaccines over others. Let me ask for the next slide. This question is about Myanmar. So the question is, do you approve of ASEAN's response to the Myanmar crisis? And this is about what ASEAN has done. So there is an even split with slightly higher approval than disapproval, as you can see from the numbers. At the country level, apart from Myanmar itself, which was overwhelmingly disapproving, the country that registered the next highest level of disapproval was Thailand at 39%, followed by Singapore at 37%. Brunei was the most approving of ASEAN's response at more than 58%, possibly because they were the ASEAN chair and they had to respond to this crisis. Indonesians were the second most approving of ASEAN's response at above 44%. Again, possibly because they were actively involved in diplomacy with regard to Myanmar from the very onset. Next slide, please. So this slide drills down into that earlier question and asks the people who approve why they approve, and later on there will be questions of the opposite. So the top reason, well, first let me say that for this response, only 517 respondents answered this question because they approved ASEAN's response. So the most cited reason for approval is that ASEAN has taken active steps, more than 42%, followed by a recognition of the institutional limits of ASEAN, which is 30%. And the third reason is non-interference can only be stretched so far, which is just below 20%. So at the country level, Brunei at above 51%, and Singapore at just over 45%, their respondents cited ASEAN's institutional limits and its inability to override the intransigent attitudes of Myanmar stakeholders as their top reason. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, which is of the group that disapproved of ASEAN's response to Myanmar. What are their reasons? So 691 respondents answered this question. The top reason cited is that ASEAN is moving too slowly in response to the escalating crisis, which is more than 45%. And this same reason was was the top reason for respondents from 7 countries in ASEAN. A distant second choice to this question is that ASEAN is not utilizing harder methods, above 26%. And this was a top choice for 3 countries, with one actually being in a tie with the earlier reason. And these countries are Myanmar, Malaysia, and Vietnam, where there was a tie. And lastly, I think the outlier from the other countries is Cambodia. Their top reason for disapproval was that it wanted ASEAN to engage with all relevant stakeholders in Myanmar and at the international level. This is the last question that we go through under this section. Still on the question of Myanmar, the question was asking what is the best way to move ASEAN, for ASEAN to adopt to move forward on the Myanmar crisis. So the highest preference was for ASEAN to engage in independent trust building. This is almost 38%. This is actually quite an interventionist approach, perhaps in recognition of the polarity and differences between the different groups in the country. The second choice is for ASEAN to coordinate more with international partners. In other words, go for a diplomatic solution. More than 24% cited this. And the third choice is to adopt harder methods against the State Administration Council, such as suspension and sanctions. So at the country level, Myanmar is the most pro-intervention, while Laos is the least. Okay, so that is a summary of the main questions that regarding regional issues. So let me now turn to our discussants for the first round of responses to this section on regional developments. Discussants, you are of course free to comment on anything in this section so far, but perhaps you could especially comment on the top concerns of Southeast Asians, and also whether ASEAN has responded well to the pandemic and whether regional recovery efforts are adequate. So for this round, I would like to take an outside-in view of the responses by to the survey, and perhaps I can ask Professor Evelyn Goh to speak first, looking more from the outside, from the Western viewpoint. Then Professor Zha, the view from Beijing, and then Professor Thitinan from Bangkok, and then lastly Professor Chan to round up this round. So perhaps I can ask the slides be taken off for the time being, so we can have all the discussants. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Choi. Very happy to start, and thank you again for the invitation to participate in this launch. Congratulations to ICES and ICES colleagues for yet another wonderful edition of this survey. Just to address Mr. Choi's question directly, perhaps I can say a little bit about, give an outside view of the segment of the survey on perceptions of ASEAN's dealing with the pandemic then. First thing to say, I think, is, as I think your summary has shown really well, there's a great deal of regional variation, isn't there? There's been a great deal of variation in the experience of the pandemic across what is a very diverse region, and therefore tracking to that also a great deal of variation in how national respondents have responded in terms of how they've assessed their individual governments, states' means of dealing with the challenge. From an outside perspective, what's often really helpful is if we've got an actual comparative experience. So I'm in the very fortunate position of having recently been able to leave Australia for the first time in 2 years because the borders opened. And my first destination was actually Southeast Asia. And so I'm able to give that comparison, and from that point of view, there is no doubt that some of the best performing parts of Southeast Asia have indeed, by comparison, dealt incredibly well with the pandemic. And then one gets a sense in places like Singapore, particularly where ICES is located, that there is a very clear move towards living with COVID and business and sectors opening up in a way that we're not necessarily getting with that degree of confidence in other parts of the world. Again, there is a great deal of variation. But the other thing that I think marks out the Southeast Asian experience with the pandemic, of course, is the relatively better experience in the region in terms of tropical medicine and public health systems. And I think that we've seen that come to the fore actually in all Southeast Asian countries, again, to slightly different effects, but I think that has placed the region as a whole on much better footing in terms of short-term dealing with the pandemic. I think a lot of the more reserved responses we're finding in the survey have to do with the perceived slowness of economic reopening and recovery efforts, economic recovery efforts in these countries. And I think that picture is going to keep evolving, and it'll be interesting to see what the survey results will be next year this time, if that's going to be done. I think we'll get a better sense of the response to the economic recovery efforts then. Thank you. I'll stop there and turn over to other panelists. Thank you.
Professor Chan?
Thank you very much for having me here. I had the luxury of reading the full report as well, and also the report from previous years. You've done great work. I thought respondents were overly modest about ASEAN's achievements. Over the past 2 years, the spirit of ASEAN centrality and its resilience is on full display. If you look at the achievements like RCEP, which went ahead and now implemented, and also DEPA, which Singapore played a greater role, spearheaded a globally applicable agreement on digital matters. And if you look at ASEAN summits, this year they actually attracted more active participation from the United States as well. And you've kept up with the dialogue with the dialogue partners. So in comparison with many other parts of the world, ASEAN has achieved a lot. On the Myanmar issue, I also thought the greatest achievement is to have avoided how to respond to Myanmar as a part of a big power competition. Should I mention, if you look at Ukraine or other situations, this region in Southeast Asia, it's a remarkable achievement that this has been stayed away from, kept away from a superpower competition. Now on the vaccine issue, it does seem to me the really structural issue in this region, which people tend to forget, is actually the first and foremost is not reputation of any product. Any vaccine is work in progress. Many vaccines took decades, if not centuries, to develop. And each vaccine is on a trial and error basis. So then I actually thought the issue is less of the vaccine diplomacy, rather two structural issues. One is, how does ASEAN in the future take the lead to help deal with the structural impediment of regional public health collaboration? You see, the member states of 10+3 are actually in two different regional offices of the World Health Organization, the West Pacific and South Asia. So ASEAN should play a bigger role in trying to strengthen regional cooperation structure in everyday public health. And secondly, with vaccines, we are moving into a situation where we have to do more research on not just COVID and other vaccines. We also need to take into consideration this global competition, especially out of North America and Europe, for vaccine production chain, supply chains, and the ingredients and the final production locally. And in this regard, how we safeguard the resilience, resilience means different things, how we safeguard the smooth, by smooth I mean science-based, and also driven by serving local needs of this region, and in terms of vaccine collaboration in vaccine research, development, production, and distribution. There are lots of things to do. Time is of the essence. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Prof Thitinan?
Hello, hi. Thank you very much. First, I wanted to say thank you for inviting me and to congratulate and thank Director Choi, Sharon C, and the team. This survey is always a regional public good, or even an international public good. Someone has to do it. So thank you for doing that for us to see the whole picture of the region. I have just a few suggestions and points. I won't take more than 5 minutes. First, about the methodology. I think it's a good idea to do a 10% weighted average, but I think to complement that, the national survey turnouts, I think, have to be much more even. So we have a very small turnout in Brunei and Cambodia and Laos, for example, and in the Philippines, it jumped. This survey completions jumped threefold. That's one. I think my first suggestion would be the in terms of sampling, the representativeness, and then apart from the national survey completions, you also might think about how to weigh the different affiliations. So I noticed it's very protrusive that the Philippines on the government surveys is 65%, right? So you'd think that Philippines, the civil society category would be a lot higher than 6%. So that's protrusive and a bit odd to me. Vietnam, there's a civil society turnout of 21%. That's also, it stands out somehow. Indonesia, civil society turnout a bit lower. So, and academia think tank, more than 50%. Now, having said all that, I think that the different country representativeness through different categories may be rethought a little bit for the next round of surveys. But on the whole, because of the 10% weighted average, I think the ASEAN categories come across as very logical and sensible. It makes sense to me on the ASEAN as a whole. So the 10% weighted average, I think, is a good method to go about this. But to complement that, you need the different countries. You have to bring up the survey completions. The Philippines, I noticed that you might have hired or might have had an agreement with someone to a local agency to do it for you. If that's the case, you might try to think about doing that across the region to capture, random sampling. Second, I just say the pattern that comes out of this is similar. So it reinforces previous surveys in the recent past. China is the dominant economic power, but there's a lot of reliance in the region looking at Japan, US, EU for political, strategic cooperation and hedging and balancing. So that's a pattern we've seen before in past surveys. Cambodia is an outlier here, really an outlier in many categories. I was a little bit surprised to see climate change jumping into the picture noticeably. So pandemic certainly very clear. The economy, recession, people are concerned about that. Climate change, 37%, that's a lot to me. And in terms of sampling, I think that one, if I remember correctly, I think it was Philippines and Vietnam, very high respondents, high number of respondents, but not as much on Indonesia, which surprised me. If you had a lot more respondents from Indonesia, it would make even more sense. So I think, overall, coming down from the pandemic, it might have been good to ask also when people thought the pandemic would be over. You might look at the percentage of the vaccinations, towards reopening and so on. So that might have been another issue we could look at. Another one is the vaccines. Very interesting. Cambodia is an outlier again, trusting Sinovac, Sinopharm, but most of the others trust higher trust in the Pfizer, Moderna. The Quad AUKUS, again, to Cambodia is an outlier, but this fits a pattern of the Laos and Brunei as well. So Brunei, Laos, Cambodia seem to be on one side with more sympathetic, supportive of China. And here I come to my just very 5 short takeaways from this survey. First, ASEAN is divided. ASEAN is divided, and perhaps a little bit more divided than before. ASEAN centrality is being tested, and I think I mentioned the BCL, the Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, very much on one side, and the others on the other side, depending on different issues. Myanmar has become the new front and center issue for ASEAN. It's sucking the oxygen from the regional discussions and debates and discourses. In the recent past, South China Sea was mentioned a lot. This time, not so much, but it's all about Myanmar and Myanmar again. Climate change is a kind of emerging issue that I think we can pay a bit more attention to, especially among the maritime member states. And the UK has entered the picture here as a kind of a standalone country post-Brexit. The major powers, the role, relevance, and intensity of major powers rivalry and competition, I think, has gone up, compared to the last surveys. And ASEAN centrality, effectiveness has come into the question more than the last surveys. Finally, the last point I say is implication from this to me would be how to regain the ASEAN narrative pre-COVID, because now ASEAN, you cannot talk about ASEAN as a 10-member regional grouping because Myanmar is out now. So it's almost an ASEAN 9, the ASEAN community and all the 3 pillars, all that narrative now is gone. So how to regain that is our task, I think, our challenge ahead. Thank you very much, Director Choi.
Yeah, thanks, Prof. Actually, we will come back to quite a few of those issues that you mentioned in the later part when we go through the next 3 sections. So yes, thank you for sharing in advance also, but we will also come back to some of these issues later on. So we will be happy if you can elaborate further as well at that time. Now over to Prof Chan on the regional issues.
Thank you, Shing Kwok. I will be as brief as I can be. First of all, congratulations to ICES. This is a very rich document. I've been following every edition, and I think this year is richer. And every year it improves, so congratulations. The 2 questions, COVID and the pandemic and Myanmar. Briefly, much has been said. I think overall ASEAN did well and the responses show it. But 51% yes, that countries did well seems to be a bit low. There were uneven responses and performances among AMS. And I would also like to highlight that it matters when you take this survey. 2020, I think ASEAN was still, with the governments, we thought we did very well and so on. It dragged on to 2021. And you did the survey in November, December. So there is, pandemic, COVID fatigue. So this, in fact, affects the countries and their evaluation of the governments. And it is also the Delta variant. And then around the corner, Omicron. So I think people are not in very high spirits, and you get this a very critical view of how the government has performed. Now, there are 2 kinds of performances. One is what the government objectively does and what did ASEAN do. Secondly, it is how people feel about it. And the feeling comes with economic recession, the recovery, lives versus livelihood. So all that enters. So at the end of 2021, ASEAN citizens are quite critical. Let me point out that there are things that ASEAN countries did do. And it's really, when you look at the overall performance, it is access to vaccines and it is resources. Western countries had access to vaccines and resources. Some of the wealthier ASEAN countries were able to do this better. Singapore did better, Brunei did better, our governments came out, rated well, but I have to say the Singapore government, my view is that actually they did quite well in the whole way we approach Omicron, the whole pandemic, but even there, people are impatient at the lockdowns and so on. Now it's endemic. Now, what has not been raised is that ASEAN did, in fact, come together and we came out with responses to the pandemic as a grouping. We created the ASEAN Response Fund, the COVID Response Fund, CARF, and it's a fund where people pledge money and our dialogue partners pledge money to buy vaccines, $28 million US. It started with us putting the money, Singapore did that, and the other dialogue partners came in. So there's a standing fund. And 1 million is given to each country, ASEAN country. And I think we in Singapore returned our million to the Secretariat and say redistribute that. But the point is the fund is there. We also have an ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, which addresses, and this was from the leaders' 37th ASEAN Summit. It addresses broader questions than just the health question is the economic recovery as well, and what we are doing about markets and digital transformation. So there's some idea of how to tackle this problem. And Japan has responded in the Japan-ASEAN Summit to look into this framework, and is brought up also with the China-ASEAN Summit. So there's a broader view of how to do things, and there are other measures that ASEAN did too. There's a regional reserve of medical supplies for public health we are building up. And 3 countries, Singapore, Vietnam, and Thailand, are putting supplies as a start. Other countries will give, but we are in fact trying to create this reserve of medical supplies for health emergencies. So we're thinking through, and there are 1 or 2 other things, but you get the message. I think at the government levels, governments try, but they're hampered by access and by resources. Also, fundamentally, the healthcare system does matter in each country. Quickly to Myanmar. I think, I belong to the school that thinks ASEAN did reasonably well. Could we have been acted faster? I think on the humanitarian aspects, we can act much faster. But could ASEAN have been harder? There are institutional and structural reasons why ASEAN cannot move as fast as it can, as it wants to. Some ASEAN countries want to, because we have a consensus approach. And first of all, by being harder, our constitution does not allow us to suspend the country, the member state, and does not allow us to expel the member state. Of course, there's nothing to stop ASEAN rethinking and introducing this, but we are not there. And I think the ASEAN, this is the only ASEAN we have, let me put it this way. And ASEAN as a creature has come up with a consensus principle because it makes the 10 countries comfortable. Change that some, and I don't know that you can keep the members together, and ASEAN centrality will be harder. Our aim right now, and this will affect every question we answer, is how to keep ASEAN centrality and ASEAN united. When you discuss major power rivalry, trust, the way we react on issues, this is central. And I think we have to do that. We go too hard, and I know the young people in Myanmar want ASEAN to move faster. I get that, I understand that, but you do deal with what you can. You have a UN and special envoy now, and she wants to talk to every stakeholder. Some question about whether she means power sharing, and there's been objections by NUG to her view that maybe she's saying power sharing now. No, I think we should talk to every party. And I think ASEAN should work with external partners. We now know global issues are not just to be handled by your own grouping. We all need each other's support. And I hope ASEAN can work with external partners. ASEAN can work with each other to deal with Myanmar. That's it.
Thank you very much. I think everyone has given good insights, perhaps also looking at how the responses sometimes capture the perceptions rather than perhaps to some extent some realities. So we don't have time to pursue. It would be great to pursue some of these issues further, but we don't have time to do so. So I'm going to move on to the next section, if I may have the slides back up. So this next section is on the regional powers and their influence and leadership in Southeast Asia. So the first question in this section, which country or regional organization is the most influential in economic power in Southeast Asia? And China remains the clear leader here, with a slight decrease in respondents saying so relative to last year. This is followed at a distance, I must say, by the US at 9.8%, though it is an increase for the US from 6.6% the year before. So at the country level, the US has gained significant percentages from respondents across most ASEAN states, but more particularly in Malaysia, in Myanmar, in Philippines, in Singapore, and in Thailand. ASEAN comes in third, but its influence has shrunk to 7.6% from 10% last year. Let's move on to the next slide. This is the question, what is your view of this economic power's influence on your country? So the region continues to be worried about China's growing regional economic influence, with more than 64% of respondents expressing this view, while just over 35% welcome its growing economic influence. While there is generally a slight decrease in the level of anxiety about China's growing economic influence from last year, an increase has been recorded amongst respondents in some countries. These include Laos, Myanmar, and Singapore. On the flip side, most respondents welcome the regional growing influence of the US and also of ASEAN, as you can see in the chart. However, I must point out that in absolute numbers, the respondents who welcome China's influence still outnumber quite significantly those that welcome the US or ASEAN, because these are all based on the subdivisions of the respondents. Next question. So now we move on to the political and strategic influence. So which country has the most strategic influence in Southeast Asia? So here again, China is now the choice of the majority as the most influential political strategic power. Last year, it was just below 50%. This year is above 54%. So it increased by almost 5%. The US at 29, just above 29%, is the second. Its increase was marginal, increased by 1% from last year. ASEAN was third, but has declined by about 3%. So at the country level, if we look at the respondents, China was the pick for this in 9 out of 10 ASEAN countries, with the strongest views coming from Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. The Philippines continues to be the only exception. The Philippines is the country that chose the US at 51% of them over China, which 37% of them chose China. Next slide. So again, the follow-on question. What is your view of this power's political and strategic influence on your country? So the region remains worried about China's growing strategic clout, more than 76%. Although this is a slight decrease, it's a significant decrease from last year where it was at 86%. And this worry is mirrored in all countries except 3 countries. And the decrease in the worry is mirrored in all countries except 3 countries where it increased. And these countries are Myanmar, Singapore, and Laos. There's a greatest acceptance of China's strategic clout in Cambodia and in Malaysia. The greatest worry comes from Myanmar, Singapore, Philippines, Brunei, and Vietnam, which are all above 80%. So in contrast, again, respondents welcomed ASEAN and the US for their growing regional political and strategic influence. And particularly for the US, it has strong support, more than 70% to support from Vietnam, Singapore, Myanmar, Philippines, and Brunei. Next slide. So this question is about who do you have the strongest confidence in order to provide leadership in championing the global free trade agenda? Confidence in the US expanded, and it actually now is the top country that the maximum confidence in for them to provide this leadership in free trade. China is in second place at 24%, and it is actually up from a low 13% last year. ASEAN is third, dropping from its earlier position, now also dropping by more than 5%. The EU, who was last year's front runner, actually now is placed fourth, and Japan only fifth. Let's go on to the next attribute, where confidence in leadership is for the issue of maintaining the rules-based order and upholding international law. The positions of the countries voted top have changed significantly. The US is now top at 36.6%. ASEAN and EU are quite close as second and third, above 16% each. As the US was a top choice in 6 of the 10 countries. They are all named there in the slide. And ASEAN was the top choice in 3 of the countries that are also in the slide there, while China was the top choice for only Cambodia. Next slide, please. And this slide and the one after talks about the minilaterals. So this question is about the strengthening of the Quad in the last 1 year and the prospects for tangible cooperation in areas, especially like vaccine security and climate change. This has proven to be positive and reassuring for Southeast Asia because more than 58% agreed with the statement that the strengthening of the Quad will be constructive for the region. And this is especially the case in the Philippines, Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Myanmar. Of the 13.1% who disagreed with this statement, it is particularly strong in Cambodia. Next slide. Now, this is about the Australia, UK, US trilateral security arrangement. So the question was, how will this AUKUS arrangement affect regional security? So the top choice for this 36% felt that AUKUS will help balance China's growing military power. And this was especially evident in respondents from Myanmar and the Philippines. There's also 1/3 that feel that this will be escalating the regional arms race, and also another 12% that feel that this will undermine the nuclear non-proliferation. Approximately 1/5 feel that this would weaken ASEAN centrality. And I think this was particularly a concern in Laos. So there's quite a lot of rich issues that is in this section. And perhaps I can now turn over to the panel to react to the slides that I have just presented. There will be no particular order in which I would just like to invite you to come on to comment on this as you feel that you have comments to make. Yes, Evelyn, go ahead.
Perhaps I can start. I found this to be a really interesting section of the survey. And thank you again for the public good that you've provided, as Professor Thitinan mentioned earlier. I guess I have two sets of reactions to the data in this section. The first relates to the first part of what Mr. Choi summarized very helpfully for us. And I think we couldn't have failed to have observed that Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, and to some extent Singapore have all come up, in the high, have been very represented in the recognition of the increasing primacy of Chinese economic influence in the region. B, registering a higher anxiety towards the effects of Chinese economic presence and influence in the region. And then C, this sense that the perception of political and strategic influence is very much correlated in some ways, to the perception of economic power. So Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar, for example, as you indicated, had the strongest views, right, on China's importance as a political and strategic influencer in the region, tracked to those strong views about its role as an economic power as well. Now, what's interesting about this subcategory of countries, particularly when you look at Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia, is that other recent studies, of course, have shown, have narrowed onto these three countries as well to show that, on the one hand, these are the ones that are most likely, based on economic profiles and ties with China, to become quite vulnerable economically, right, to any disruption in their economic ties with China. I've also done a study that shows that these are also the three countries which are most likely to be overexposed and quite potentially dependent upon China in terms of investment as well, and that's a growing trend. So I think that does track. In that light, though, it's Laos and Myanmar that registers those concerns. And again, backing up what Professor Thitinan mentioned earlier, Cambodia is the outlier, right? It's the one that doesn't, in spite of these economic vulnerabilities, doesn't demonstrate that degree of concern that the other two countries do. So that's quite interesting, I think, in a comparative studies perspective. If I might just, on the second theme, just very quickly reflect on the findings about the regional reactions to AUKUS and the Quad, again, coming from my institutional setting in Australia. This would, of course, be of interest to many of my colleagues in Australia. I think, to me, it's striking, that finding about the proportion of people who thought that AUKUS would present another avenue of balancing China. And, that was a bigger proportion than the proportion of people who thought that this would exacerbate the arms race in the region. To me, that was an interesting finding. And it does actually reflect the tendency within Southeast Asian strategic constituencies to think in a diverse way about balancing. It's Southeast Asians don't tend to think about balancing in a dyadic format. We've tended to be omnidirectional in how we think about ways to constrain power, if I may put it that way. So that finding, to me, does reinforce that sense that Southeast Asian states and constituencies are quite open to different ideas and different modes of how to temper potential excesses of power in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. Yes, Prof Thitinan.
Thank you. I'll be very brief, Director Choi. The takeaway from this section, now that I'm going section by section, China's growing power is undeniable, is inexorable. That's very clear. But the reactions to that, I think, are very interesting. So whether it be on free trade or rules-based order, Quad, AUKUS, the range of ASEAN's member states, they want to hedge or look to other sources. So these are the US and ASEAN, EU, and so on, to counterbalance China's growing power. So there's some nuances in this section compared to other previous surveys. On Laos, Cambodia is all in on China. I think most categories very clear from this survey. But in Laos, I think there might be some reservations and misgivings, and I wonder if this real connection between Kunming and Vientiane might have played into it. So we have to look closer into that story. On Myanmar, Singapore, Myanmar, I think that when they look at China over the past year, the concern would be on the negative side, that China's dominance would affect the domestic politics and the support for the military regime. Finally, I'll just say that it would be interesting to, in terms of methodology, look at the younger demographics and see how they respond in Cambodia to these questions. Thank you, Director Choi.
Thank you.
Come in now, Shing Kwok.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. I want to respond first to Evelyn's point that, when she looked at AUKUS, for the Australian strategic community, it would be interesting that the region thinks that those who think it will help balance China's growing military power seems to be the most dominant response. But I would urge her to also look at the 3 subsequent responses, which are: it will escalate the regional arms race, it will weaken ASEAN centrality, it will undermine the nuclear weapons non-proliferation regime. There are the other aspects which also trouble some of the ASEAN citizens, I would say AMSs. They have different views. So it's not, so you should read the 36.4% that see it as a balance against some of these split views on the specific aspects they are concerned with. But let me just put it, my reaction to this whole discussion is that it's very clear that there's this growing recognition of China as the most, powerful or influential strategic and political presence. And ASEAN countries, many of them, are not very comfortable with this. This is a reality. They have to live with China and they want to deal with China as well. But it's a question of how do you handle this presence, and so they look around for partners and so on. And it's interesting to me that the reactions that they see the United States as the leading global free trade, sort of advocate and the power, the presence that can deliver that, and also in introducing global international norms. So it's ASEAN reaching out, and that's why I think you see the numbers thinking about the United States more favorably since the Biden administration came in. So this is partly this idea of how do you balance the Chinese presence, and that they are looking for a rules-based order. I would like, there's been talk of Quad, Indo-Pacific strategy, and these are also, I would say, strategic responses, initiatives to this presence. And there has been an expression, I think, earlier in the discussion that what's going to happen to ASEAN? Are we relevant? What about ASEAN centrality? And I would just like to make the observation that when ASEAN sticks together and we hang together well, we can push back some. Certainly even with China, and we've seen this in the past when ASEAN took a stance together, we could in fact push back China. I think it was one of the meetings in China and it was over, I think it was South China Sea. Now, in this sense, ASEAN coming together and speaking in the same voice has done something about Quad. When Quad started, it sounded very much, and I think ASEAN had qualms about it being about the containment of China. But the language of the Quad has changed about delivering public goods. We are into inclusive coalitions, and responses and initiatives, and the Quad did not sound so inclusive. They have absorbed the language of inclusion also. So I would not dismiss ASEAN, because when ASEAN sticks together, we come up with one voice. The major powers change their language, and that's what's important. I saw this with Quad, and now Quad is asking for cooperation on, humanitarian and public goods delivery, and is that something some ASEAN member countries can participate in? And I would say with the Indo-Pacific strategy, White House has just come out with their statement of the strategy, the framework. It is, some details are lacking, but I think it spells out, something far more detailed than I have seen. And it puts an emphasis on prosperous, knowing full well that it should be open, but it should be, they go for prosperity, resilience, and so on. And I think because they hear from the region that we really are interested in the economic parts, it's about a prosperous region. How they fill it up, we can go into the details, and some may not like some of the things emphasized. There's emphasis on labor standards, environmental standards, and I know some countries will find that hard to live up to, but the point is the United States is now thinking about the prosperous part. It did mention trade agreements, but maybe that will come, some aspect of that will come. So I guess the point I want to make is that if ASEAN sticks together, you can have some influence. So ASEAN is not irrelevant, and you can still do something about ASEAN centrality.
Thank you. Prof. Zha?
I was listening and amusing myself. China. Well, it's, as one of the participants noted in the Q&A box, a lot of times it's how we narrate these matters and the use of language. Having said that, I was thinking about Lithuania, right? Talking about dealing with the Chinese influence in the way it does. No, I'm not going to talk about that anymore, but basically I'm really saying that for me as a scholar based here in China, and as I relate to my colleagues, both in and outside government, certainly to my students, this is a lot of food for thought. How China conducts its foreign policy, economic policy, and how Chinese entities and individuals relate to others, both here in ASEAN and even as far as the Baltics. So what I'm really trying to say is that the real challenge for here Chinese scholars, including diplomats, is what we take off this. The takeaway is the need for introspection and self-reflection and eventually self-change. Because if you just refer to Chinese language expressions, there's a lot of talk about commonality or even a shared future. And that's the slogan of the Olympics, the Winter Olympics and whatnot. But I do disagree with the framing of economic influence, because over the years, probably first out of Australia, this has been very sharply worded. It's sort of anybody, ABC, anybody but Chinese. Why? Because the political system is different, because it's state-owned company. But when you really peel that off, yes, it's a state-owned company. Yes, it comes from a country that's different. But once that investment is approved locally, you have a local governance regime. It's registered as a local company. You can discipline, you can terminate the contracts. So we have to stand guard against this influence matter. And the ideological dimension of that is tearing apart many. It's not just international instruments like trade agreements, including bilateral trade agreements. It's diplomacy, it's a lot of domestic societies. Some of the jobs have to be lost, some projects have to be terminated simply because of this concern about influence. Of course, the Chinese society went through that. We had the books that talking about selling out China when we invited foreign investment in the country. But all these societies, but that does not necessarily mean when we when you have investment projects from China, we need not to be aware of them. We can singularly focus on what some business school textbooks teach about value chains and profits. We have to work with the local authorities to enhance better wealth redistribution in the society where we invest. We need to work on the supply chains within the countries, and rather than just thinking about doing it for the benefit of an outside investor, if a sense of community was going to emerge in longer term. Last but not least, I don't know if there are Chinese diplomats listening, but that's okay. I'll say what I want to say. Now, over the years, the diplomacy in terms of using economic instruments in handling political disputes, first over THAAD with South Korea, later on with Australia, although these disputes dated way before the Australian initiation of the independent investigation on the COVID management, way before that. These things need to be better explained, both domestically and also better explained overseas. And it thus far has done this overall imagery of China no good by being so blunt and being so, it does easily invite this divide and rule tactic, whatever, that's quite apprehensive on many parts, in many parts of the world, including when others do that to China. So there are a lot of other matters to talk about, but I do feel that the findings are important, and probably down the road, research institutions like ours can do a job to come back to revisit some of the framing of the issues. The word is returning to a sort of ideological lock-in that's so characteristic of the formative years of the first Cold War, the 1950s. And that's dangerous.
Thank you, Professor Zha. Now, I think the next section will actually dig even deeper into some of the issues that we just talked about. So I will move on to present those findings so that we can continue this dialogue with the additional information. So this is about ASEAN in the middle of who? Between the US and China, basically. So these questions, the first one, ASEAN is caught in the crossfire between Beijing and Washington. So how should ASEAN best respond? And the answers, 46%, not quite a majority, but close to it, feels that it should enhance its own resilience and unity to fend off pressure from the two major powers. I think Professor Chan earlier said ASEAN has agency, so those who chose this certainly believe that ASEAN can do something about it. The second choice, distant second choice, is the traditional position of not choosing sides. And the third option is to seek out third parties. And the subject of third parties will come, I think, in the next, which is also the last section of the survey that I'll present later on, which will be a very short one. So I just want to point out also that in the changes that have taken place, remaining neutral, which is one of the options offered, is no longer seen to be so practical. So now there are fewer people choosing the option to say this is impractical and therefore they have to choose sides. Okay, next question. So if ASEAN were forced to align with one of the two strategic rivals, which should it choose? So the point is quite clear on the slide. 57 versus 43, still quite weighing into the US. Very little change, just marginal change from last year's result. And the greatest support for US coming from Myanmar, Philippines, and Singapore, and those for China from Cambodia, Laos, and Brunei. At the country level, I think of the 7 countries actually chose the US, while 3 chose China, and those that chose China, the 3 that are on the slide. There were shifts in the country level. For Cambodia, as Thitinan had pointed out earlier, it's very entrenched now. 81% actually chose China up from Cambodia. For Myanmar, it's the opposite. It is now 92% for the US. Okay, next slide. So now if ASEAN were to seek out third parties, who would it seek out? So who would be the most trusted? So the front runners are the EU and Japan. And the numbers have actually dropped significantly for Japan by about 8% from last year. Australia remains a distant third option at just over 10%, followed by the UK at about just over 8%, and then Korea and India in that order. Compared to 2021, the numbers choosing Japan and India have reduced, while the numbers choosing Australia, UK, and Korea have increased. At the country level, the EU was the top choice for 8 countries. And the exceptions to this are Laos, who picked Japan, and the Philippines, who actually had a tie between the EU and Japan. Next slide. Which statement most accurately reflects your view of China's reemergence as a major power with respect to Southeast Asia? 41.7% view China as a revisionist power with intentions to turn Southeast Asia into a sphere of influence. This is the same top choice as last year, but the numbers that chose it has reduced slightly. Same for the second top choice, that China is gradually taking over the role of US as a regional leader. This has also declined from last year. Nevertheless, together, they still make up 2/3 of all respondents, the 2 chosen options. The options of China as a benign and benevolent power and China as a status quo power have increased correspondingly. So there is a slight uptick on those 2 options. Next slide. How do you see China's relations with your country evolving over the next 3 years? As far as those that expect to improve, the numbers are about the same as in 2021. So just over 46% expected to improve. The numbers that expect it to remain the same has declined. So it's now just below 33% as opposed to almost above 42% last year. And those that expect it to worsen has increased from below 12% to just above 20%. So most optimistic are Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, and Thailand, whereas those who expect it to be neutral, those from Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam. Those who expect it to deteriorate, Myanmar and the Philippines. And I think there are, of course, local conditions that may make those 2 countries be indeed more pessimistic. Next slide. So now this is asking what could potentially change or worsen the positive impression. This is for those who answered that they expect relations to improve. So 553 respondents responded to this because they chose the earlier option that it will improve. And of this group, more than 50%, they would be more concerned if the growing influence will continue to grow in the coming years. The second choice is about the South China Sea and the Mekong. If China were to assert itself using strong arm tactics, this is particularly a concern for all the South China Sea claimant parties in Southeast Asia. And the third highest concern is about the use of economic tools, including tourism, to punish the country's use of its own independent foreign policy, or practice of its own independent foreign policy. So these are the top reasons why positive perception could become more pessimistic. Next slide gives the contrary, the opposite question. For those who thought that their relations with China would worsen, what can China do to improve? So 528 respondents actually responded to this. So most of them, 77%, feel that it will improve if China were to respect their country's sovereignty and also not constrain their own foreign policy choices. So this is top for Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Singapore, and Thailand, all the countries listed there. Closely following behind is the reason that China should resolve all territorial and maritime disputes peacefully, according to international law. And the countries that picked it top, surprisingly, I guess, is Cambodia, but the rest, no surprises. Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. Okay, next slide, which is also the last in this section. Now turning the eye to the US, the respondents were asked whether the level of US engagement with Southeast Asia under the Biden administration has increased or not. And the number who say that it has increased is about just below 46%, a very significant drop from the previous year where it was 70, almost 71%. But it's nevertheless is still almost half. A third believe that the level of engagement is unchanged from the previous year. So particularly Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines feel this is so. Yeah. So I think the optimism at the country level is expressed by respondents from 5 countries: Singapore, Myanmar, Thailand, Brunei, and Vietnam. Whereas respondents from Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines are more of the view that things have not been changed, have not really changed. Okay, so now let's start another round of discussions on these latest findings. So perhaps on the Biden administration, comments on how should they be satisfied with what they have done, and is there anything that China can do more to improve so that it can become the preferred partner? Yeah. Let me open to all the whole panel, and you can just unmute and talk. Maybe we can let the Southeast Asians talk first, and then after that we go to the external parties. Yeah. Thitinan, you unmuted. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Choi. I'll be very quick. I know we're running out of time. Look, I think the broad contours here are very clear that countries in the region broadly looking towards the US for more support, more countervailing support vis-a-vis China. And the view that China is a revisionist kind of power is also very clear. For third parties, we're seeing patterns of the recent surveys in previous years. EU, Japan, but as I said earlier, UK has emerged as a kind of a new element in the mix after Brexit. I'll just say a little bit about Thailand since I'm here. The fact that Thailand, the respondents saying that China is taking over, gradually taking over the role in the region, is partly reflective of the concerns about US domestic politics in my view. Because the news flows, the US is always divided, polarized, looks very toxic, very intractable. The Mekong, I think the pattern we're seeing, South China Sea, Mekong, and then the other economic coercive tools. The Mekong now is becoming more and more of an ASEAN agenda item. So I think that's a significant addition to me. Myanmar is emerging as an outlier on the other side, meaning that if you have Cambodia on this side, Myanmar is very critical of China, very concerned. And I also noticed the respondents, we have a very skewed sampling because Myanmar is 20% of the, the returns from the survey, whereas Cambodia less than 5%, Laos less than 3%. So I think going forward, if we can build up those national turnouts from the other countries, we get a more accurate picture, I think. Thank you, Director Choi.
Okay, Prof Chan, I think you're unmuted, so I guess you're going to say something.
No, thank you. What can I say? Let me just make this point first, that I should have said it during the discussion on the COVID pandemic. I think because the COVID pandemic features so big in the minds of AMSs, the countries and the people, that I think how the external powers dealt with COVID or dealt with the region over COVID infects a bit how they view the countries. For instance, frankly, yes, everyone is concerned about the growing presence of China, the influence of China's strategic and economic presence. But if you looked at what you just showed us, the slides, the re-emergence of China as a major power with respect to Southeast Asia, actually the fact is seen, the percentage who see them as a revisionist power has dropped in 2022 compared to 2021. So, they're not so sure China wants to be a revisionist power. True or not, but that's the figure you get. And what struck me was the view of Japan, and you've shown this, as a player has fallen. The trust in Japan slightly dropped, although it is still one of the most trusted partners. But as a player, and your slides later will show this, do they have confidence that Japan will actually deliver on, prosperity, global security, and so on? The numbers have dropped by about 14% from last year. I relate this to the COVID. I think how these countries reacted on COVID impacts overall in a vague way in their evaluation. So I would not run away from that. And the United States has picked up because when it was during the Trump administration, 2020, I think there was great disappointment in the United States. 2021 with President Biden coming in, a lot of things just picked up, not just over the pandemic and the pandemic support, but also in Quad, in Indo-Pacific strategy. But, I've said this in other forums, ASEAN likes a Goldilocks policy. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. And if it gets too hot, they want the major power to retreat a bit. If it's too cold, they want them to come in. So, and it's all about balancing China. It is about balancing China because that is seen to be existent. We have to live with China. It's not that we don't want to befriend China in the region, but how do you balance and create a more multipolar presence so that smaller AMS countries, and all of us are small compared to China. Indonesia is bigger. We have more room to move. So ASEAN is always looking for, balance in the region and to work with that balance. So I feel that that's what I want to highlight. There are so many things I can say, but I don't have time, and you don't have time for me.
Thank you. Professor, would you like to go before Evelyn?
No, Evelyn can go first.
Okay. I guess I would pick up on the third-party hedging choices part of what went earlier. I think it might be helpful in future years, perhaps, if we could try to make a distinction between what it is that the surveyed respondents are being asked to think about in terms of hedging against uncertainties. It will probably be quite helpful to splice that question out into economic hedging and security hedging, because I suspect that some of the responses in this year's results particularly is actually showing a mix of both. For example, we do see that increase of turning a preference towards turning the remaining preference for the EU and Japan being quite marked, but I suspect that a lot of that is accounted for in terms of thinking about the European Union, as an important, continually important economic partner for the region. It is amongst the top. Every year, it is amongst the top 3 of the region's economic partners, and if you take it as whole, it's always the top partner. The Japan one is a little bit unclear. I suspect that the share for Japan and India decreasing, while the share for Australia and the UK particularly increasing, has to do with a sort of assumption in the responses that this is tied to security expectations in terms of hedging. So some way to be able to splice that out, I think, would be very useful, and it would certainly help us to explain, that interesting new blip in terms of the UK coming up in the rankings this year. So I think that would be fairly interesting. And even though the two things are quite tied, economic and security expectations, I think in this one, it probably can be spliced out quite usefully. And in that regard, just let me say that I've put my clarification to Ambassador Chan's earlier, that exchange with Ambassador Chan earlier on the AUKUS response issue into the chat box so as not to take up time in here. Thank you. I'll turn to Professor Zha.
Again, there is a vocabulary issue here. The notion of a country being revisionist, that depends on the reference point one is holding. And also the notion of coercion. There are different understandings of causality. And sometimes I talk to my colleagues both in Southeast Asia and anywhere else to say probably the most difficult part for us to study international relations is to come to agree on the chronology of events that led to the conclusion, because descriptions are value-based as well. So bearing that in mind, I would think, going back to what I said earlier on, that it may not be that helpful to both here for us here in China and also for for observers outside in other geographic regions to somehow mentally map China as an external element, an external actor. After all, geographically, we are adjacent either by ocean or by land, and then we cannot rewrite the history of human migrations, the domestic. Earlier, Professor Thitinan mentioned the domestic elements, including the ethnic Chinese networks, and also going back to what was said about influence. I quite agree with Professor Chan's argument, that is to say, ASEAN should not be seeing itself, defining itself as the vulnerable party here. You come to think about it, if we did not have frameworks like ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum, right, which is often laughed about by some writers outside of the region as talking shops, we would not have, we would be far worse off in this region. ASEAN should continue to be omnidimensional, omnidirectional. And I have not commented on Quad or AUKUS. There seems to be, those things are evolving, and there seems to be a division of labor for AUKUS to focus on traditional geostrategic matters, and for Quad to be more on non-traditional issues like vaccine production and distribution. There is space for need for these kind of activities, especially the non-traditional area. As far as the conceptual and analytical part of it, discussions ought to continue, but then we have to nonetheless make space for the epistemic communities. We're talking about the doctors, the scientists, and the technicians or whatnot, the managers, to relate to each other, try to think about how we can emancipate for that community to interact rather than forcing them to face a choice, because how we talk about international relations, how we talk about diplomacy can come back to affect their work, affect, frankly speaking, even as directly as the approval of a collaborative research project. That the provision of public good, earlier, I think it was Evelyn who mentioned this concept, has to be, I hate to use the word inclusive, because that implies someone who assigns itself to be the leader and agree to take on whoever by choice. Provision of public good has to be involve all contributors one way or another. We have to go beyond this notion of development aid as an instrument of policy, or an instrument that deals with these concerns about who prevails in that analytically neat competition, or defined in the geostrategic way. I spoke too long. Ambassador Choi, forgive me. I will speak less next time.
Thank you. Thank you. We are actually running a little bit behind time. So in the last section, I will just, there are only 3 slides, and I will combine our response to this with the Q&A that follows, because there are those sections, the questions that pertain to this. Okay, so the last section is on perceptions of trust. These are many questions. So if we go to the next slide, this is a summary of the findings from the various questions. So basically, if you look at not the box, the bottom part of the slide, Japan continues to be the most trusted power, but it is a slimmer majority, so it's 54% now, dropped from 68. The US has jumped to 2nd place. It is now 52%, whereas it was only 47. And the EU is now fallen into 3rd place, and its number this year is 48.5%. So if you look at the box now above, so relative to last year, China and the US both increased in their trust perceptions, whereas the other 3 countries mentioned their lost grounds. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So here is the perceptions of trust. Okay, so we summarize here in this slide the thinking regarding these 5 countries and also compared to 2021. So we can see that Japan has dropped. So let me explain where it dropped. The largest swing was in Cambodia, where it dropped from more than 80% down to just above 32%. Also, it dropped in Thailand significantly from about 65% down to 46%, and in Myanmar from 76 down to 58. But Japan is still very trusted in the Philippines, where it's more than 80%, in Vietnam, more than 60%, and in Myanmar, 58%. Why the advance for the US? Biggest swing actually is in Myanmar and Thailand. Myanmar increased, actually doubled from below 40% to close to 75%. Thailand improved from 39% to almost 54%. What is surprising, perhaps, at the country level is that Brunei has dropped in its trust for the US from 48% to 30%. Okay, so the rest of the information is in the table and in the slide. I'll not elaborate. Okay, the next slide is on the perceptions of distrust. So a few findings about China here. The level of distrust has declined, but only marginally, from 59.6 to 58.1. And actually the levels of distrust towards China are higher than the levels of trust in all ASEAN member states except Cambodia. And it is most palpable in Myanmar, Philippines, Singapore, Brunei, and Vietnam. And the reasons cited for this distrust is about China's economic and military power, perhaps being used against the country's interest, which is almost 50% who cited this reason. And 23% felt that China was not reliable. A little bit about India. India, the levels of distrust declined, but only marginally, from 52 to almost 48%. And the doubters of India are actually the majority in 6 countries: Singapore, Brunei, Malaysia, Myanmar, Indonesia, and Thailand. And the reason cited most popularly is that India does not have the capacity or political will for global leadership. And secondly, that it is distracted by its own internal and subcontinent affairs. Okay, so those are the slides. So now I think we will have the Q&A, which has built up quite significantly. You can react to this as well as some questions that I will now select. So let me start by selecting those that have to do with countries other than US and China, so that we can deal with those, give some time to those. So let me sorry, now okay, we have a question here from Danielle of the City University of Hong Kong. And she, I believe she asked if the panelists think that Japan will step up and double down on its efforts to engage with Southeast Asia in the post-pandemic era, and quite possibly because of COVID, that its overall influence has decreased. So, would you like to address this question? And I think there's also a question, I can't find it right now, but if you would like to talk about India and the EU as well, so please, I'll turn it over to the panel if you would like to respond. You don't? Yeah.
Can I go first?
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. Will Japan step up and double down on Southeast Asian engagement post-COVID? I think as Japan comes out of it, it certainly will, because traditionally, Japan has been one country that has really provided a lot of public goods to Southeast Asia. Ever since they found out that Japan was not loved, in the earlier phase, Japan was too dominant a presence, and it took over from the US as the ugly American, the ugly Japanese. Now, and during that time, there were riots in Jakarta when Tanaka visited. And I think the Japanese were so surprised by that. They have launched a special diplomacy towards the ASEAN countries. And they've been great friends of ASEAN, helping in the industrialization, the development, and so on. Yes, I expect to see Japan come back. And I think in the Quad, in terms of the vaccines distribution, they will probably be providing some of the money. US and Japan and India is supposed to be producing the vaccine. So I see that coming. And in the Indo-Pacific strategy, they are the one partner that can come up with the money, the investment, push the economic aspects. That's it.
Yes. Would anyone else like to respond to this? I also clicked on questions with regard to EU, as if you would like to respond to that as well, you can.
What's the question on the EU?
Thitinan, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I know we're running out of time. I'll just be very quick. On the question about Japan, I think Japan, it comes across pretty well in this survey and recent survey, even though the percentage has gone down a little bit. I think Japan has a dilemma. It's been long-standing, and it's a matter of emerging into the 21st century. I think Japan has not arrived in the 21st century, especially in the 2020s. So when it comes to economic influence, geoeconomic heft, we can see Japan all over the place, but building on its previous role. But now China is also outcompeting Japan in some areas, especially big tech areas. So I think now Japan has to decide what kind of a great power it wants to be. It's not a straightforward middle power. It can be an upper middle power, but the part that's missing is the strategic and military dimension, the Article 9 Constitution. So Japan will increase its role, it will double down, it will step up, but it has to decide what kind of a great power it wants to be. I just have three quick reactions to this section, Director Choi, and first, I think Myanmar is emerging very clear again. That is on the other side of, Cambodia is all in on China. Myanmar is becoming kind of all out on China. And it's interesting because the sampling size of Myanmar is 20% of the entire number of respondents, and almost half of that is from government. So even government employees, government officials are aligning with civil society and academia and think tanks. So very interesting on Myanmar. I think on Thailand, I'll just say, Myanmar, Thailand, the US perception of trust has gone up because I think for Thailand, in recent years, the ruling elites have realized it may have gone too far to the China side. Now the US is back, and here related to that is a shift from Trump to Biden. I think that has moved up the trust in the US significantly. Thank you, Dr. Choi.
Okay, if possible, I would like to extend this webinar by another 10 minutes. I know some of you may have to go, some of the panelists have to go. We would please proceed to do that if you if you need to go. But if the rest can stay, we can try to do a little bit of further answering of some of the questions in the box. So I had just also flagged out the two other questions. One was on the role of the EU. They asked whether there is a further role that the EU. This came from Ramon Zander. Whether you see what you see the role of the EU in Southeast Asia for the next few years, and also another question from Seongyang Yang, who is from the ROK mission to ASEAN in Jakarta, and his question is regarding how ASEAN could engage other parties besides the two major powers to, for example, UK and Australia, and also what can Korea do? What could Korea step up to do?
Perhaps if you don't mind, Mr. Choi, can I have a go? And I do apologize in advance that I have to leave at noon to chair another meeting. So I do agree with a lot of what's been said about Japan, and I'd just like to add that, you know, I think we don't look at Japan, you know, from 2020 onwards, right? We look at a little bit of the trajectory before that, and if we look at particularly Abe, the second Abe prime ministership era onwards, we do see a rising trajectory of Japan being engaged in Southeast Asia in a variety of ways, and most notably in terms of security cooperation with key Southeast Asian countries in a number of sectors. And I don't see that, you know, going away at any time soon. And indeed, Japan has found different channels, multilateral channels, to reinforce that. So I do agree that you know, Japan will continue to be a very important third-party actor that actually has a demonstrated economic as well as security presence in the region, and that makes it different from some of the other third-party actors. To respond to the clutch of questions that you've just highlighted, Mr. Choi, I think, you know, this question I'm very often asked, right, both by Europeans and also Australians, you know, what can we do more in Southeast Asia to be engaged and, you know, to have our own Indo-Pacific strategies and so on. And now that I'm in talking to a Southeast Asian audience, I'd like to say that I think to some extent, you know, ASEAN and also individual Southeast Asian countries may want to think about this as a moment in which you would want to shape this as well, right? For, you know, since the 1990s, you know, ASEAN as a whole has had this approach that, yes, we're willing to work with all partners. We want to have as many stakeholders as possible, right? And we would like to have this omnidirectional, diverse strategy, both economically and in security terms. But I think in the current period of quite intensified great power rivalry, ASEAN has the opportunity to define more clearly what it means by what it wants these multiple but quite different stakeholders to be doing. Where do they want individual stakeholders like Japan, like India, like the EU, like the ROK? You know, where would they like them to be focusing their efforts to help Southeast Asia diversify and stabilize regional order? I think that is something that ASEAN is in a position to do and probably needs to do, to refine this notion of what it means to have a, you know, I'm calling it loosely a diversified regional order. I don't like the word multipolar. You know, and that's one way in which ASEAN agency can be expressed, and it's very important that that be done at this juncture. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Evelyn, and thank you for staying until you have to go. Are there other responses from the panel regarding EU, Japan, and perhaps UK? Yes, Prof Chan. Yeah.
Yes, I'd like to answer the question on EU and Korea. You know, Korea has engaged with ASEAN before and played a role, and it has a going south policy. But the thing with Korea is that they're very concerned about the Korean Peninsula. And I think rightly so. So sometimes the attention is diverted. But Korea has a lot to offer. You know, it is technologically, in terms of its technological development, it's a major chips manufacturer. In technology, is up there, cybersecurity and so on. So I think ASEAN countries will look on Korea as an investor. They've invested in Vietnam, in, you know, Myanmar. It's different countries, you know, Southeast Asia. So it's a source of knowledge, technology, and investment and trade. So I think there is a role for Korea. In terms of the EU, I think everyone is looking forward to the EU to participate because it's been one of the major investors in ASEAN. You know, apart from China, US is EU that is quite a major trading partner. So the EU will always have a role. And now the EU has stepped up certain countries, France, Germany, Britain. They have indicated an interest to be in security terms in the region. Now, many of, apart from Germany, France and Britain were in the region previously as colonial powers, and they have a historical presence. And if ASEAN wants to really go for a rules-based order and learn what it is to have a rules-based order, I think, you know, these countries can help to educate, explain what an international rules-based model would look like and be. It is now sending naval ships through the international sea lanes of Southeast Asia, in Asia. I think that's what it would do as individual countries, France, Germany, Britain. I hope it does not carry a NATO flag, and it should not. Because when I saw Xi Jinping and President Xi Jinping and President Putin's statement, you know, that they do not want to see NATO expansion, and Indo-Pacific was added, you know. I think that's probably the concern of China, and it would be ASEAN's concern too. I talked of too hot, too cold, just right policies. Individual European countries coming through using the sea lanes, make the sea lanes a fact of being international sea lanes, and that's important. But if they fly a NATO flag, and NATO, you know, is always looking out of area, they've been talking of out of area since the end of the Cold War, out of area or out of business, okay? So they've gone to Afghanistan, but I don't think we would want to bring NATO into our region. It just hardens everything. And my view, you know, as an analyst would be, and I think this would be ASEAN's concern too, you know, if I could speak for them, but I think I'm not wrong there, that they would not want to have NATO coming into our part of the world. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Professor Cha, you unmuted. I assume you want to comment on this question?
It's very difficult to comment because I had conversations with our European colleagues on many of the matters Professor Chen just mentioned, and in a few days I will be conversing with some colleagues at Harvard on this whole notion of a rules-based order. And order could not have prevailed if without observance of rules. The very term itself is a puzzle. What exactly does that mean? I'm not trying to drive myself nuts, or because I speak, partly because I speak English as a second language, but I do share a number of concerns that were articulated before. And number one is that people, especially for us in international studies, tend to forget to make the difference between style and substance, between history and the contemporary action, action of the day. Japan has been and is a very, very productive actor throughout the region. Just one quick anecdote, you know, people use WeChat. That's about, here in China, that's about 20% of the entire population of the world. But where were the barcodes invented? They were in Japan. And then the Japanese companies or government has not made a fuss about, somebody else commercializing out of this. And in terms of development aid, going back to what I have been working on more heavily in the recent years in terms of the everyday pandemic, everyday disease tracking and research, Japan, South Korea, and China, we have those communities that have been working quite well. But then, Southeast Asian countries, individual countries, rightfully have asked, Japan, China, and Korea, to help set up a number of research institutions that deal with tropical diseases and deal with food safety and a host of issues. Why are we talking about these matters in international relations? We have to bear in mind that there is a societal good we're serving. And Southeast Asia is not just some place for large countries to come to demonstrate this or that to tout that their achievements. But on the issue of relating to Quad or AUKUS, and then this NATO expansion, I strongly feel that NATO took the wrong term, let me emphasize, by writing into the document, its mission document, that somehow to deal with China as a systemic rival. Now, mind you, the term systemic, and a lot of times it's poorly translated to Chinese as a systematic system, right? Comprehensive. And these things matter. And then coupled with, this notion just somehow there were naval presence here in this part of the world, World War II and before. And then these ships, military ships, have a right to flag the right to come here and just to, let's say, raise the flag again. I asked my German colleagues, what exactly do you want to demonstrate if there is an ideational point, right? And it helps it's very costly to us here in China, because you have that those sort of acts harden the sentiment of saying, all right, what's the mission of China? Should we here in China be building up a naval force that can show our flags in the waters of Europe, in the waters around America, right? Yes, you can show the flag. And you can continuously argue about international law, whether it's a continental shelf or special economic zones, or whether it's international waters, blah, 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 the tracking. But in the end, what do you really want to get? In other words, other than keeping a domestic military industry going, finding a justification, can we return to, in other words, goes back to the notion of revision, goes back to the notion of status. Lastly, I would think the EU an institution is also in search of a mission. I earlier had some harsh words about NATO, but on the other hand, the EU's emphasis on norms, its emphasis on rules, its emphasis on regulations, and its emphasis on quality, including it's a little controversial, such matters as carbon tax for protecting the environment. These things are very useful. And the challenge is not so much how ASEAN should be cherry picking the entities. The challenge, including here for China, is how to take these insights and or the actions that are the policies that are done, firstly to address EU concerns or any others concerns, and then refine domestic policies and say, what useful elements are here to help strengthen domestic regulations and to improve domestic governance. On that basis, I would think the survey is very useful, and in terms of the number of participants and also the participants themselves, the individuals. But my last word is that for consumers of this kind of knowledge, we need to stand guard against simplifying this to be saying this, it represents a unifying country view. We have to go back to thinking about how we can emancipate ourselves from that ideological, certainly that exists in all societies, including China, that ideological appeal, which can a lot of times turn out to be self-restricting and destructive to others. Does that sound like a professor from Beijing? My goodness. And I don't know. Sometimes, sometimes I'm kind of, this is not just joking, right? Partly because of isolation, the more webinars I attend, the more I start to feel that it's hard for us to say anything, because lots of times whatever we say gets interpreted as, oh, it's another Chinese, doing that in a condescending way and lecturing us. I hope that what I just said did not go across that way. And if that was the case, I apologize. And it's certainly, it's not the fault of the organizer, certainly not our very nice ambassador choice. Original, we did not discuss anything before when I came on this.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Zha. I think that's all the time that we really have. I think Thitinan had to go, Evelyn had to go. I won't prolong on the patience of our two other discussants any longer. Thanking all of them. It has been very stimulating to have all their reactions to the survey. For the participants, thank you very much for sending in so many questions, but unfortunately we couldn't get through all of them. And for the media who have been asking, the launch, the document, the survey report is already launched and the embargo has been lifted, so you can go ahead and publish it. So thank you to everyone, and let me hand back to the MC to close the webinar.
Thank you, Mr. Choi, and our esteemed discussants, Professor Chan Heng Chee, Professor Zha Daojiong, Professor Thitinan Pongsudhirak, and Professor Evelyn Goh for your enlightening insights and active participation in the discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of the program for the e-launch and discussion of the State of Southeast Asia 2022 survey. The digital copy of the survey is now available for download on the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute's website, www.ises.edu.sg, and you can find in the chat box a direct link to the report for your reading pleasure. Thank you for joining us today, and we wish you a pleasant day ahead. Stay safe and stay healthy.